Welcome. We are going to shift to talking about a new type of formal logic, that is propositional logic. So far we've talked about syllogisms, now we're going to talk about propositional logic. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about what this new form of logic is. So the general objective is this. I'm going to explain what propositional arguments are and how they work. Specifically, we're going to understand what makes something a propositional argument, the difference between propositional arguments and syllogisms, and what it means for a propositional argument to be valid. Propositional logic studies whether or not propositional arguments are valid. Propositional arguments are arguments that use premises that make claims about the truth or falsity of the sentences in a particular set of sentences. They then attempt to use these premises to prove a conclusion. The easiest way to understand this is to look at an example. Here's a propositional argument. Terry was in Pittsburgh last weekend, and there was no way that he could be in Pittsburgh and steal the jewels. So, Terry did not steal the jewels. Here's how this argument works. It's basically saying, well, this is true. Terry was in Pittsburgh last weekend. It's also saying there's no way both of these things could be true. Terry was in Pittsburgh last weekend, and he stole the jewels. Conclusion, it couldn't be true that Terry stole the jewels. Let me give a point of contrast here, and that's a point of contrast with syllogisms. Just like propositional arguments, syllogisms use premises to prove a conclusion. But syllogisms work by talking about the way that certain categories relate to each other. For example, or rather, let me start by saying some syllogisms are valid. Valid syllogisms work because of their form, not their content. That is, they work because of how they relate the categories to each other, regardless of what those categories are. That's why I was able to give you arguments that talked about subjects you knew nothing about, but you could still figure out that the argument was valid. For example, all troparia in the second tone use a soft chromatic scale. All troparia with the melody be quick to anticipate are troparia in the second tone. Therefore, all troparia with the melody be quick to anticipate use a soft chromatic scale. Now, I'm assuming you don't know what troparia are, second tone, soft chromatic scale, and that you never heard of the melody be quick to anticipate. Although it's really catchy. In any case, you can tell that this is true because of the form. It's saying all troparia with this feature are troparia in the second tone. Right, which is basically saying, looking at the conclusion, hey, if a troparion has that melody, it's got to be in the second tone. And then the first premise told you, if it's in the second tone, then it's got to use a soft chromatic scale. Right? So the conclusion is, right, it has to be the case that if it has that melody, it uses a soft chromatic scale. And you can tell this because of the form of the argument and how it relates the categories to each other without knowing what those categories actually mean. So, to remind you, if a syllogism has a certain type of form, we say that the argument is valid. And the argument has a valid form if no instance of its argument form has true premises and a false conclusion. Now we're going to look at propositional arguments. They do not relate categories to each other. Instead, they work by talking about whether certain groups of sentences are true or false. For example, the pirates stole the treasure or the guards stole the treasure. The guards did not steal the treasure, so the pirates must have stolen the treasure. This kind of argument proves a point by making claims about whether certain sets of statement are true or false. So let me explain how this works. Our argument said the pirates stole the treasure or the guards stole the treasure. The guards did not steal the treasure, therefore the pirates stole the treasure. Here's what it's basically doing. It starts by saying that one of the following two statements is true. That's what the first premise told us. The pirates stole the treasure, the guards stole the treasure. It's telling us one of those things has to be true. Step 2, which was the second premise, said, well, the following statement is false. The guards stole the treasure. Now then we notice something. Wait a minute. If one of those two statements has to be true and the second statement is not true, right, well, then the first statement has to be true. Okay? Because if both of them were false, well, then we couldn't say that one of them was true. Right? So we draw the conclusion. The following statement must be true. The pirates stole the treasure. Now note, I put the sentences themselves in small type for a reason. The content of those sentences plays absolutely no role in the reasoning process. That is, if someone asks you why the argument works, you would not say anything about pirates, gold, or treasure. You would say something about what we mean by or and not. Just like with syllogisms, if someone asked you how that weird argument about troparia worked, you wouldn't talk about what troparia were. You'd say, well, look, this is what all means. Okay? This is what it means to say all S are P. And just based on the form of the argument, you can tell that the argument works. So notice, this was our explanation of the example. But we could substitute in other sentences and it will work the same way. John likes falafel and Mary likes hummus. Right? Well, if one of those two statements has to be true and the first one is not true, well, then the first one has to be true. Okay. Or, here's more stuff about troparia. The troparium for Tuesday is in the second tone. The troparia for Tuesday is more than 10 words long. Well, if those two statements have to be true and the second one is not true, well, then the first one has to be true. So, just like syllogisms, propositional arguments have a form. Unlike syllogisms, the form of a propositional argument has nothing to do with how it relates categories to each other. The form of an argument has to do with what the premises and the conclusion tell you about the truth or falsity of sets of sentences. Right. And again, like syllogisms, propositional arguments can be valid or invalid. A propositional argument is valid if no argument with the same argument form has true premises and a false conclusion. The key difference is this. Syllogisms are valid when they relate different categories in a way that makes it impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Propositional arguments are valid when they make claims about the truth and falsity of sets of sentences that make it impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. For example, this argument that we saw before is a valid argument. The pirates stole the gold or the guards stole the gold. The guards did not steal the gold, therefore the pirates stole the gold. Well, that is a valid argument. If one of the two sentences has to be true and the second one is false, well, then the first one must be true. So there's no way that the premises could be true and the conclusion false. More to the point, there's no way that an argument with that form could have true premises and a false conclusion. Now, the following argument is invalid. George Washington was the first president, or John Adams was the first president. George Washington was the first president, therefore John Adams was the first president. Well, that doesn't work, right? In fact, that one has true premises and a false conclusion. If we ask, well, is it true that one of those two sentences is true, or at least one of those sentences is true? Well, yes, right, because the first one's true. Is it true that George Washington was the first president? Yeah, that's true. Is it true that John Adams was the first president? No, that's false. So right there, we know it's an invalid argument. Its premises are true and its conclusion is false. And just as with syllogisms, we can say that because this one has true premises and a false conclusion, any argument with that form is going to be invalid. Here's an important implication of what we've seen. Propositional arguments have a form. The form of two arguments can be the same even though they are talking about very different subjects. For example, here's the argument we saw before. George Washington was the first president, or John Adams was the first president. George Washington was the first president, therefore John Adams was the first president. The following argument has the same form. James Earl Jones did the voice of Darth Vader, or James Earl Jones was in Field of Dreams. James Earl Jones did the voice of Darth Vader, therefore James Earl Jones was in the Field of Dreams. Those have the same form. Notice, what determines the form of the argument is the claims that the premises and conclusion make about the sets of sentences, not the contents of the sentences in the set. Notice here, these have the same form because of the following. The first sentence says, this is true or that was true. The second sentence says that the first thing was true. And the final sentence says that the second thing was true. Right? Even though one is making claims about presidents and the other is making claims about James Earl Jones' acting career, they have the same form. They're dealing with different sets of sentences, but they say the same things about those sets of sentences. The following arguments, in fact, have different forms. They deal with the same subject matter, but they relate them to each other in very different ways. They're both dealing with the claims George Washington was the first president and John Adams was the first president. But the first one says George Washington was the first president or John Adams was the first president. George Washington was the first president, therefore John Adams was the first president. The second one says George Washington was the first president, John Adams was not the first president, therefore George Washington was the first president and John Adams was not the first president. On the left, we have an argument that says this is true or that was true, this is true, therefore that is true. The other one says this first thing is true, this second thing is true, therefore both of them are true. Dealing with the same simple sentences, but saying very different things about their truth and falsity, which means even though they're talking about the same subject matter, they have different forms. So this brings us to an important point of vocabulary. We can talk about a valid argument. An argument is valid when no interpretation of that argument has true premises and a false conclusion. We can also talk about sound arguments. An argument is sound when it is valid and all its premises are true. So, as a summary, a propositional argument works by making claims about the truth or falsity of sets of sentences. The form of a propositional argument is a matter of what claims it makes about the truth or falsity of these sets of sentences, regardless of the content of the sentences. An argument is valid if no argument with the same form has true premises and a false conclusion. An argument is sound if it is valid and has true premises. In terms of vocabulary, in propositional logic, when we talk about the way that an argument relates certain terms to each other, we call this an argument form. Specifically, when we talk about the way that the argument relates the truth and falsity of sets of sentences to each other, we call that the argument form. When we talk about the specific argument, we call it an interpretation of the argument form. An argument form is valid if no interpretation of that argument has true premises and a false conclusion. An argument is valid if it has an argument form, and an argument is sound if it has an argument form and all true premises. Now you'll notice everything here is just the same as with syllogisms. Okay? All the terms mean basically the same thing. The differences are this. First, for whatever reason, instead of instances, we use the term interpretation. Second, it's all the same, but remember that with syllogisms, this is determined by how the categories relate to each other. With propositional logic, it's about what it says about the truth or falsity of sentences in sets of simple sentences. So that's what I have to say about propositional logic. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me or come see me in office hours. Thank you.